Morning, good afternoon to our participants in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world. My name is Ken Propp, Senior Fellow here at the Atlantic Council Europe Center and moderator of today's program on the international implications of the UK's data protection reform. I'm pleased to be joined by four excellent panelists today. We have with us Jenny Hall, who is the Director for Digital Policy at the UK Ministry for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. We also have with us Aaron Cooper, Vice President of the Business Software Alliance, Vice President for Global Policy. Cameron Carey, Distinguished Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Gabriela Zanfir Fortuna, Vice President for Global Policy at the Future of Privacy Forum. This will be an interactive discussion. We will have an opportunity towards the close of the program for audience questions, which we welcome. Please send those to us using the audience QA function on your screen. And please follow on Twitter at AC Europe. When the UK left the European Union, it initially incorporated the EU's General Data Protection Regulation into its domestic law, specifically in order to enable data transfers to continue to occur from EU territory to the UK without interruption. Last year, the UK government began an exhaustive public consultation on how to, quote, seize the benefits of Brexit, unquote, in the area of data protection. And several weeks ago, in mid-June, it released a report on how it plans to chart a more independent course in this area. These policy recommendations will shortly be turned into a legislative proposal in a bill that the UK government is planning to put forward soon. Our conversation today will look at the envisaged changes from several perspectives. One, what principal benefits do they offer companies operating in the UK and transferring data internationally from there? Are they useful modernizations from the EU's GDPR? Second, how are these changes likely to be received in Brussels? Could they potentially put at risk the UK's adequacy finding from the European Commission that its data protection laws are essentially equivalent to those in the EU? And then finally, a transatlantic dimension. We're going to inquire how these reforms might be instructive for efforts in the United States to enact a comprehensive US data protection law and attendant regulatory developments. And can they, beyond the United States, have a broader impact in the world in promoting convergence among data protection regimes? With that, I'd like to turn first to Jenny Hall. Jenny, thank you for joining us today. As I'm sure you know, data flows between the United Kingdom and the United States form the biggest component of overall transatlantic data transfers. And so one dimension we're interested in is how these reforms that your government is pursuing are likely to affect this dimension of digital commerce.
Thanks, Ken. I think that's a really great question. I wanted sorry, I briefly got cut off there, but hopefully I'm back. Before diving into that, I just wanted to say a quick word to acknowledge some of the political changes that have taken place in the UK in the last week, which are of course deeply relevant, given our Minister for Data, Julia Lopez, who was actually really looking forward to being at this talk today, and indeed who signed our first in principle adequacy agreements with the Republic of Korea last week. Unfortunately, she resigned last week along with several of her colleagues, as you will have seen. But I and my team, as is the case in our system, are completely unchanged and still working very hard on this agenda. And we actually have a new minister in place who we've spent a good chunk of time with already in the last few days, responsible for this portfolio. So reforming, exactly as you've just described, the kind of UK's objectives here and our efforts to reform our regime remain a priority for the government, and the legislative reforms that you reference that were mentioned in the Queen's speech are still very much a priority for us to move forward with as quickly as possible. So watch this space a little bit on that. But on your specific question, I mean, this really goes to the heart of why this is a priority for us and why we think this is so important. Championing international data flows with the UK's most valued partners is absolutely at the heart of the UK's approach to data policy and indeed broader foreign policy. You can see that with our approach in our G7 presidency last year, where we promoted the data free flow with trust agenda, the various work we've done in free trade agreements, a range of different places. So I think, situating it within that broader policy context is important. But then when it gets to, data protection policy itself and our lived experience of GDPR, as well as the feedback from stakeholders that we've heard through the consultation process that you reference, and indeed wider conversations too, we do think there are improvements and evolutions that can be made. I think we see that a lack of clarity about some of the rules can lead to risk aversion. And in recent years, of course, we've seen volatility and disruption to transatlantic flows that have affected us all. And I don't think that was necessarily anticipated, and that's something we really want to look at closely. We'll have to wait for the legislation to get the specific details of what we're looking to do in this space, but in terms of some of the principles, to give you a sense of our direction of travel, I think you'll see, specifically in the approach to transfers, our language, the language that will be incorporated into the legislation, will really emphasise the importance of data flows and the mechanisms that support them. We will look to give powers to our Secretary of State to be able to expand the list of transfer mechanisms to respond to global developments, so to make this more sort of future-facing, forward-looking as far as possible. As I've mentioned already, stability and clarity are really, really important for us. I think we see competing interpretations at the moment of the same legislation and a bit of a fragmentation of approaches. We'll try and be as clear as possible in the approach that we want to take to try and ensure we can be as clear and stable as possible. And then I think the final theme that hopefully you will see come through when this legislation appears, and it's actually true of the whole legislation, but relevant to this point on transfers, it's a focus on outcomes. So what do we actually want to achieve? We know that different countries have different systems, different approaches to privacy, often rooted in very different cultural, constitutional setups, legal traditions. We want to get to a space where we look at what the outcomes are, what are the standards that they're protecting, rather than the specific way in which they're going about doing so. So more of a focus on the end result rather than, irrespective of the way in which things are designed. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour, and yes, a commitment that you will see more in this soon, and we'll be able to get into a little bit more detail soon.
Thank you. You mentioned at the outset that the UK has now reached an agreement in principle with the Republic of Korea on mutual adequacy. And that, as I understand it, is part of an ambitious program to negotiate adequacy agreements around the world. The report quite clearly says that you are after what you call an autonomous framework for international data transfers. Could you tell us a little bit more about the destinations that you're interested in, and in particular, whether and to what extent you expect friction with the European Union as a result of that negotiating program.
Yeah, certainly. So I guess the first thing to say is that the UK already has an autonomous and independent regime. It just happens to be one that we inherited from the EU. So I think there's kind of two parts to the answer to your question. The first is actually how we make use of that power in that regime now. And that's what you saw with our in principle agreement with the Republic of Korea. And, you know, as you know, these things take time, and there's kind of detailed assessments behind the scenes, but it's you know, public knowledge that we are prioritizing work with the United States, as you would expect, with Australia, with Singapore, with the Dubai International Finance Centre, and a few others. So while we have our existing powers, we will absolutely look to use them, and we will look to use them as ambitiously and as pragmatically as we possibly can do. And complementing that with work on innovative mechanisms to complement those wider agreements. But I think in part through doing that, through doing some of this work using our existing regime, as well as, you know, the consultation and the wider work that we've done with industry, with civil society, with researchers, with the people for whom, you know, this really affects, I think that has actually really helped us to identify areas where we think we might be able to improve. And I think, you know, why wouldn't we do what we can to take those high standards, to take the real importance of trust and responsible data use, but to see whether we can do so in a more pragmatic, more user-friendly way, and to come back to that stability that I referenced previously. So I think, you know, to answer, to sort of come to the second part, we're not going to stand still on this, and we don't think you can stand still in this space. So we will do what we can with our existing regime, and you will see in the legislation a you know, slightly new approach that is trying to fulfil those principles that I set out previously, and is trying to do so to achieve those objectives that I set out with, and this government has been really clear on, about enabling the flow of data across borders, but retaining those really high standards and high data protection. In terms of friction, I mean, actually, I think, you know, the EU are doing a lot of thinking and working in this space too, and whether it's specifically on, you know, the GDPR and adequacy mechanisms, or whether it's work with us and other counterparts in multilateral fora like the G7 or the OECD or others. So I think we don't see the need for friction. We see a need to work together, to engage, and we do work with them very closely, both bilaterally and multilaterally, and to try and set ourselves up in the best possible way for a future where data is just going to be so important. We really need to, that's why we're investing so much time and effort in this agenda right now.
You referred to the negotiations with the United States, among other countries. The U.S., of course, is we believe in the final stages of its own negotiation with the European Commission on a successor to Privacy Shield. Would the completion of that negotiation between the United States and the EU potentially have a positive impact on your own negotiations with the United States in terms of sequencing?
So I think, I mean, we're already deep in conversations with our partners in the US administration, and actually you may have seen my Secretary of State and the Commerce Secretary published a joint statement back in December when she visited the US, noting good progress on adequacy talks or you know, transatlantic flows talks, as well as a wider data agenda. So there's an awful lot of work happening behind the scenes directly with our colleagues on this, on, you know, ensuring that we have a good agreement in place, but as I say, also ensuring that we work together on some of those broader challenges. And we want to take the time to make sure we get it right and to make sure that it lasts. We're really supportive of the EU and the US, what looks to be a good progress in parallel. It's in all of our interests for stable data flows across the Atlantic, and we'll continue to watch that with interest, but I think that's great news. But yeah, we're definitely making really good progress, and we'll hope to be able to say a little bit more on that soon as well.
Okay, well, we will look for that. And then a final question to you. In view of the change in government that the UK is currently experiencing, what is your anticipated timetable for legislative proposals, and is there the likelihood that they're going to be delayed because of the larger events?
So just a quick point there, because the slight, I guess, oddity of the British system, we don't have a change of government. So we still have the same government at the moment, the same government agenda. We've had a change of ministers. Actually, my Secretary of State is still the same and is ultimately responsible for this agenda and is ultimately the accountable person for the legislative programme in the department. So actually, the government's agenda remains as is, and we are moving forward. Of course, as I referred at the beginning, when you have changes of ministers and different things happening, then you have to take stock a little bit. But this remains a top priority. My team are working. I can tell you it's very hot here in London at the moment. We are working hot, long days to get this in a really good position. So, I can't yet give an exact date, but we're anticipating very soon. We're very much almost there, and I have a really strong team in place who've been working on this for a long time now. So all of the ingredients are there. We just need the kind of parliamentary timetabling stars to align, but we expect that to be pretty soon.
Okay, thank you. Gabriella, you follow the UK privacy developments in relation to the European Union fairly closely. I wanted to turn to you for a comment on one of what seemed to me to be one of the striking new developments in the UK proposals, and that is a pretty clear statement that they're going to be pursuing a risk-based approach to international data transfers under standard contract clauses. And that means ultimately that some risk is tolerable. Risk of foreign government surveillance, for example, cannot be excluded. However, we're seeing coming from the continent an increasing series of decisions going in the opposite direction, saying that there is actually no risk tolerance, and that if risk cannot be eliminated, then data flows to the United States need to stop, at least in certain instances. We've seen that with decisions on Google Analytics, for example, even the Zoom platform. So my question is whether this divergence, if that's what you think it is going to be a significant factor going forward for the sustainability of the UK's adequacy finding from the EU.
Thank you very much, Ken, for that question. And hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon as well in Europe. I would like to start answering this question by making first some preliminary remarks. First of all, I think it's important to mention the role that the UK had in the development of data protection law in Europe since the very beginning of data protection law. If we're looking at the UK Data Protection Act of 1984, we already see there rules on international data transfers. We even see very specific mentioning of the need of the UK to ensure that whenever transfers of personal data of British citizens are further transferred by the original receiving country, they should inquire about any safeguards that are put in place. So this idea of ensuring that the onward transfers are in line with the rules of the originating jurisdiction is something that, who knows, perhaps the UK actually brought to the EU. I would also add that you are absolutely right. The idea of onward transfers and the safeguards that need to be put in place is something that the European Commission is looking at whenever they are making assessments for adequacy. I have seen assessments about rules on onward transfers, both in the Japan and South Korea adequacy decisions, which we know are the first two ones post GDPR. There are also assessments made in the UK's adequacy decision by the European Commission. And I'm bringing the onward transfers points here because your question is directly affecting that. The question here is whether the data that will be subject to the, let's say, a review of the adequacy decision of the UK once the legal regime will actually be put in place, will have the same safeguards that are acceptable for the European Union once the data are further transferred to third jurisdictions, and whether this standard of the risk-based approach will play a role there. Very long story short, the European Commission will absolutely look at the rules on onward transfers. However, what I observed reading the relevant paragraphs in the adequacy decisions of the European Commission is that it does not go into the level of detail of actually looking into how adequacy decisions are made by the third country with regard to how they deal with their own transfers and adequacy decisions to other countries. To give you an example, in the Japan decision, the Commission indeed makes sure that the regime for further transferring data is robust. It's looking at what transfer mechanisms are put in place. It's making sure that Japan also adheres to an adequacy decision type of standard of protection, but does not look into how Japan actually makes those assessments. So there's no level of detail there yet. Yeah, so this will matter, but then I think it will also matter, in fact, how much of a divergence it will be than what it is in place right now in the UK, because there might not be a very big divergence in the end. If you're looking at the communication that the UK government published, it also makes references to proportionality. And we know that proportionality is also a standard that the European Union adheres to. So as always, it remains to be seen, but I think these are some of the points that we should take into account when looking at this question.
Okay, so not a stark difference, I think, is what you're saying to us. The UK, of course, is looking to participate in a number of multilateral data transfer frameworks, including, I believe, the APEC cross-border principles, which have now been relaunched in a globalized form. Do you see possibly the sort of the independent engagement of the UK in some of these multilateral initiatives as a positive step for the development of these systems? And does that ultimately lead to a world in which there is greater coherence, or will it not move the needle in terms of the dominance of the EU GDPR globally?
I think we are looking at a bit of those both things that you mentioned. First of all, it is certainly a good development that we are seeing new frameworks put in place whose goal is to ensure a level of protection of personal data when it travels across borders. And that is overall a positive development. And the global CDPR might be that framework that actually will manage to cover, who knows, most of the jurisdictions on the planet. However, this will not affect the rules that the GDPR has put in place when it comes to transfers of personal data outside of the European Union, they will most likely exist in parallel, just like the APAC CBPR, the original CBPR exists in parallel with the GDPR requirements. What we are also see already is that jurisdictions who are now adopting modernized data protection laws, and I'm looking, for example, at Brazil, whose law became applicable in 2020, they are also incorporating similar requirements to those in the GDPR for their own transfers. And we tend to see that approach incorporated in most, not all, but most of the new data protection laws that are being adopted. And then, you know, it becomes a question of the rule of law and having to respect legal obligations. So there is a world where they don't need to exclude each other. They can exist in parallel. And I think if you're looking at the Japan adequacy decision, you will already see a reference to the APAC CBPR there and how the European Commission found it acceptable for Japan to be part of the two systems, as long as some legal protections are in place as well, and some binding obligations.
So we are looking to a world of coexistence, so to speak, among a variety of transfer mechanisms. Aaron, your organization represents major enterprise software companies. How are these projected UK reforms being received so far?
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. As said, we represent enterprise software companies. So it's companies that are providing business to business types of software services. And when we look at privacy laws around the world as they're being developed, there are sort of two lenses that I think we generally look through. One is it a law that enables responsible companies to provide the services that their customers are looking for? And on the converse of that, does it hold responsible companies that are not acting responsibly? And two, does it provide the level of protection for individuals that we've come to expect in jurisdictions like the EU, Japan, Singapore, the US in various different ways, making sure that data subjects are sufficiently protected? And then throughout that, we're looking for, are the different laws interoperable? So going back to the first two sets of questions that you had, I think the interoperability between UK's laws with the EU, with Japan, with the US, which hopefully when we get to it later, we'll talk about how there will eventually be a US privacy law. But having that interoperability while recognizing that not all laws are going to be identical. I think the process that DCMS is going through and Director Hall's group is going through to both review the substantive provisions of the EU GDPR as well as transfer mechanisms is a really important one. And I think it's important in that there's no one privacy law around the world that everybody would point to, whether you're a public interest group or you're direct advertising company or an enterprise software industry, and say this is perfect. This gets it exactly right. We need to keep looking at laws as they're being developed to say, how can we provide more certainty, more rights for consumers, while also making sure that companies that are acting responsibly can provide the services that customers want. And I think the DCMS process does that. So thinking about an example or two that I would think of as most important, looking at the different data transfer mechanisms and how can we make sure that they are interoperable with each other is one key feature. When Director Hall was talking about the G7 process, I think that is a really good place to look for how can we make sure that like-minded democracies have interoperable, if not identical, interoperable privacy laws and transfer mechanisms. The grounds for processing which is something that's always been important for both companies and individuals. Are we going to have consent fatigue, both on the consumer advocacy side and on some on the industry side? I think both sides have concerns that is not the optimal solution, but it's definitely one part of a larger set of rules to make sure that companies will act responsibly with data. And I think the process that DCMS is going through to review those rules is very worthwhile. It's something that we see in the US as legislation is moving forward, that new issues come up that hadn't been considered at the time. For instance, GDPR was passed just because they weren't the kinds of issues that were prevalent at the time, but how AI is going to be used and how do we make sure it's used responsibly. Those are the kinds of things that I think it's been really helpful that DCMS is looking at, that we're looking at in the US in various levels, state and federal. Those are some of the key things that from the enterprise software perspective, we're looking at.
Thank you. You spoke about responsibility of companies that as being a key element here, as well as individual protection. One of the features of the UK recommendations is a greater focus on accountability mechanisms. These mechanisms exist, of course, as well in the EU GDPR, but there seems to have been less focus, less utilization of them so far in the EU context than perhaps was originally anticipated. And instead, there's a focus on external enforcement. Do you think that your member companies will take advantage of the sort of the broader accountability provisions in the UK regime once it's enacted into legislation?
Well, it would definitely depend on how it's actually written. But I think in the report, what we see is a variation on what's in the current UK GDPR. I don't think it's wholesale different. And I think it's important that there be both certain prescriptive requirements and certain requirements that can be met in different ways. So an accountability method, for instance, in doing risk assessments can include a requirement to have a data protection officer, doesn't need to have one, in order to make sure that that data subjects are being protected. But there needs to be something within the company that at a senior level is making sure that the data protection laws are being complied with. So I think it gives a level of flexibility, particularly for smaller companies. Well, the companies that I represent are software companies and enterprise focused. There are companies across the range of industries that are involved in digital transformation that have to figure out how to comply as well. And sometimes having more flexibility for companies in other industry sectors, and particularly smaller businesses, can be helpful. But it's important that at the end of the day, the accountability mechanisms still provide a sufficient level of protection for consumers, so that, for instance, getting back to your previous topic, that when the EU looks at it, or Japan looks at it, or Korea looks at it, you can reciprocally say, yes, they're not identical methods for protecting data subject rights, but they are essentially equivalent.
Yeah. You also refer to artificial intelligence as a topic that's discussed at some length by the UK. Many of the issues relating to AI have been put over, I gather, to a separate inquiry. But there is an effort to look more broadly at the purposes for which information can be reused. As companies move into an era of machine learning, where they are aiming to analyze large data sets for purposes not necessarily the same as for which they were originally collected. Do you find the UK thinking here a step in the right direction, or is this an area that still requires considerably more work?
Well, I think in most jurisdictions, we're still at the foundational stages of figuring out precisely that question. What we've suggested to governments around the world, and we put it in our comments to DCMS, is to have an impact assessment program for AI to make sure that every step of the chain, when you're developing the algorithm, when you're deciding what data is going to be used to train it, when you're deploying it, that you are going through a risk assessment, impact assessment about what the potential risks are, plus what the risk mitigation steps should be. But part of risk mitigation in things like AI and bias is making sure you have sufficient data that's representative in order to make sure that the algorithm isn't producing unintentional but biased results. So I think that there needs to be a balance there of making sure that data subjects' personal data that is not anonymized is not being used in a way that if they knew about it, they would say, no, we don't want to use that way, but is able to be used in ways that can help address issues of bias and discrimination in the use of AI, so that we can make sure that at the outset, we are doing everything we can, both from a government and an industry and an academia perspective, to have risk management programs in place that reduce the potential for bias in outcomes.
Thank you for that. Let me remind our audience that in a few minutes, we're going to be moving to audience questions. So please use the Q&A function to send those to us. Aaron mentioned a couple of times the ongoing work in the United States towards a comprehensive data protection law. I'd now like to turn to Cam Carey, who is closely involved in that process from his position at Brookings. And let's just start, Cam, with a fairly general point. Are there changes that the UK is proposing that you think are of particular relevance in the US context, either legislatively or to privacy regulators like the Federal Trade Commission here?
Well, thanks, Ken. Yes, I think that there are certainly elements of what's in the UK data strategy and the outline of legislation that are consistent with what's now being debated in the House of Representatives, where a subcommittee a couple of weeks ago reported out the American Privacy and Data Protection Act, which in many respects parallels things that are in GDPR in terms of individual rights, in terms of some grounds of processing, boundaries on data collection, use, and sharing, and data minimization provisions. But does so in ways that I think are also have differences with GDPR, and some of those differences I think align with what the UK is talking about. Significantly, the sort of the risk-based approach, privacy risk assessment is something that's incorporated in a privacy by design provision that calls for assessing and mitigating privacy risks, but is, I think, in many respects less prescriptive than GDPR is about how to do that, and adopts, I think, a sort of broader accountability regime with some of the things that Aaron talked about, data protection officers, executive responsibility, but with less of the sort of record-keeping elements of GDPR. And I think significantly, this is a place where there is, I think, alignment with the UK. Not a one-size-fits-all approach. It deals with so-called large data holders, companies that reach a certain scale or a certain amount of personal information, have much greater responsibilities than most covered entities, and small and medium entities, or so-called small data holders, will have less. So that is a scaling there. I think there, in some of those limits, there could be more latitude for the innovation edge cases. There are a number of categorically permitted uses, and some prohibited, either completely or conditionally prohibited uses. But I think there needs to be what I call some play in the joints, the edge cases, but with a real burden on the covered entity to show that that is a use that is in the interests of the individuals. I think some differences, some similarities, some differences with the legitimate interest approach, but I think needs to focus on the individual expectations and the relationship with the covered entity, and with the benefits. And then finally, I think, and importantly, which has some parallels with GDPR, is on research. Research uses are permitted. If it's public interest research, peer-reviewed research, if it complies with laws, and particularly with the so-called common rule on human subject research. That is, I think, a broad category. It somewhat parallels Article 89 of the GDPR, but I think perhaps allows more latitude than we've seen in Article 89 in the application. And I think that is an important area for the public good that research, whether it's scientific research, medical research, represents, and for AI development. Right? All of those things are things that align with what we see in the UK data strategy.
You mentioned specifically this whitelist of permitted uses. This gets to one of the areas that where the UK may be taking a step beyond the EU, and that is in further assessing this concept of legitimate interest, which is an important area of flexibility in the joints, as you mentioned. How do you see that potentially translating in the U.S., either in a statutory or in a regulatory fashion?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think part of what the whitelist does is to spell out a set of categorically categorically whitelisted, categorically legitimate uses, rather than as occurred in GDPR, leaving that up to the judgment of the business. And I think that's part of why I think legitimate interest has not, I think, really been successful in the application, at least viewed with great suspicion. And part of that is that there are uses that where legitimate interest has been applied, that privacy advocates, data protection authorities see as out of bounds, particularly in some of the marketing and advertising contexts. I think we've learned from that experience, and I think and learned from the debate. And I think I've sort of struggled over the years, going back to 10 years ago when the Obama administration's Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, trying to define what are uses that respect the context of the relationship. But I think the discussion has moved forward in important ways. There's a lot more consensus, I think, around what those uses are. And I think the advantage of that in the US legislation is that it really gets away to a much greater extent than GDPR has succeeded in doing from consent.
I'd like to now perhaps go back to Jenny to follow up on a couple of the points that have been brought out in this last part of the conversation. One is, as Cam referred to, the issues surrounding reuse of data for scientific research purposes. This has been a particularly difficult issue in the health data area, particularly during the COVID epidemic, where obstacles to cooperation with researchers across the ocean have arisen. What is the approach that the UK is going to be taking here to try to ease those problems?
Thanks, Ken. And let me just flag in advance, my internet is proving a little unstable, but hopefully it will hold out for my answer, but apologies if not. So look, we think the reuse, as you were just saying, the reuse of data can just be enormously important for scientists, for researchers in particular. And we want to make sure that can happen by making absolutely crystal clear the circumstances where it is permitted, so people don't waste time or kind of lose confidence in what they're allowed and permitted and able to do. And that for us is the principle that we're trying to get at. So you can expect to see in our approach an attempt to make things much clearer, whether that is defining some of these concepts really clearly, whether it is incorporating what's currently in kind of associated aspects of the legislation into the core of the legislation, we will also be working with the ICO to make sure that any accompanying guidance is really clear, really easy to understand, targeted at non-specialists as well as data protection experts, so you really get a sort of straightforward understanding of what is and isn't allowed. And we feel like that's got to be the right way to give people confidence. This legislation shouldn't be a barrier to sharing data, to reusing data where that is perfectly appropriate and where the protections are maintained. And that's what I think hopefully that's what you will see from us as we bring this forward.
We've been getting questions from the audience, specifically in relation to artificial intelligence, and noting that there is the need for a more protective environment in that context of data use. It seems that in your consultation report, you sort of attempted a balance here with certain areas being addressed in the report, but quite a few others being put over for future consideration. Jenny, can you tell us a little more of the thinking behind behind that as to what issues you chose to address now and which ones to continue on thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I mean, part of this really is an evolution and a conversation that we want to keep having, and also an attempt to look at some of these issues in as coherent a way as possible. So you can expect me and my team to be looking at the data protection aspects of AI, so looking at Article 22 and the right to human review and all of those sorts of issues, and absolutely trying to strike that balance that that you describe, that gives organisations the confidence to know what exactly is permitted, and but also to give citizens the confidence that they will have that appropriate safeguard as well. So definitely trying to strike that right balance. What we then want to do is situate it in wider work that is happening in the UK government at the moment on AI more broadly. So looking at AI governance across different sectors, looking at issues around fairness and transparency, and issues that actually go beyond, they're very closely linked to, but they go beyond the data protection kind of considerations that we look at. So what we've tried to do with this legislation is get the data protection aspects right as far as we can at this point, provide a sort of platform to build on with our colleagues across government working on AI, and the government is hoping to publish a white paper on, which is a sort of a detailed policy paper from the UK government this year. So you will see more a little bit later this year on that. And we're trying to sort of track that trajectory, if you like, make sure we get the data protection stuff right, but make sure that we don't close down avenues that those teams will rightly want to ask and explore in the context of that wider piece of work. So that's the delineation that we've tried to draw, and we hope that that means you know, various legislation, various regulatory approaches are as coherent as they possibly can be, given this is such a cross-cutting area of work.
Thank you. Gabriella, we've had a question going back to the comment that you made relating to multilateral fora, the G7. Another one that hasn't been mentioned is the OECD's work on government surveillance issues. We now have the UK speaking independently in these fora, and of course it has historical connections with many countries around the world. How do you see the evolving impact in some of these other fora for continuing work on data interoperability?
I think the work in the international fora is the new frontier, let's say, of ensuring international data flows, while also protecting the rights of people whose data are flowing across border. So I think what we have been seeing in the past 2 years with initiatives like Data Free Flow with Trust, at the G7, G20 discusses also about this type of issues. The very concerted effort at the OECD to have governments, democratic governments around the table and to discuss about what are the right principles, what are the democratic principles under which government access to personal data should be made. I think all of these efforts are very important, and indeed the new frontier when we are looking at data protection and privacy around the world. This being said, I think the UK can play a significant part in this fora. I also think that there is a lot that the UK and the EU have in common when participating, and I think that they can sort of support each other. And this is because I yet again go back to the history of how data protection came to be and how we are seeing these principles developing now, and the important role the UK had in establishing some of these principles. Also, let's not forget the pragmatic voice that the UK government had during the negotiations of the GDPR. For 4 years, we had relied in the European Union on this pragmatic view. And I think I'm not alone in saying that we miss the UK in the European Union, right? It definitely contributed a lot to how the rules were shaped, together, of course, with the other governments. So I hope to see the UK and the EU supporting each other and working together in exporting respect for fundamental rights when we are seeing personal data flow initiatives at this very high intergovernmental level.
Thanks, Gabrielle. I have to say I had very much the same experience as you mentioned with the pragmatic role that the UK played in a number of settings, including in Brussels. We're coming up to the end of the hour. Perhaps just one final question, quite briefly, coming from my Atlantic Council colleague Fran Burwell, who points out that in parallel to the developments in the personal data area, the EU has been moving forward aggressively with legislation relating to non-personal data or industrial data, as it's sometimes called. I was wondering, Jenny, could you give us a brief comment? I know this goes a bit beyond the scope of the consultation document, but this is an area that is increasingly going to be important as machines generate vast quantities of data. How is the UK looking at that subject going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes back to this. Yes, you're right, it's slightly separate, but actually we're trying to look at it again with that sense of coherence. So when you look at the UK's national data strategy, which we published just under a couple of years ago now, actually, our work on data protection legislation and ensuring high standards, but everything we've talked about today is one mission of 5. And one of the other 5 missions is actually looking at data sharing, data access and availability of both personal and non-personal data. So we see them as, they are separate, but they're also inherently connected. And I think, when you talk to people who actually, work in the field and kind of use this stuff, disaggregating data sets and treating things, very differently and very specifically is challenging. We want to make sure that we are enabling data sharing as far as we possibly can in a responsible way with high protections where that's relevant. But we're following developments in the EU on the non-personal side really, really closely. And as I say, we have a good chunk of our time under our national data strategy looking at what a UK approach here might look like. And, is a big legislative approach the right one, or are there other things we could look at? That's maybe a conversation for another day, but yeah, definitely something we're keen to get into.
Thank you for that. We've reached the end of the hour. I think what we've heard here is from all of our panelists really is a message that despite the UK's decision to move away from the EU, there's going to continue to remain a considerable degree of continuity in the way it approaches data protection subjects, along with some clear new initiatives. And that underscores the extent to which this really does remain a global conversation. It's not just the UK and Brussels. It reaches across the ocean with implications for the United States and obviously to other parts of the world as well through some of these multilateral dialogue. I'd like to thank all our panelists for their time and their really excellent contributions. I'd like to thank our audience for their questions. And just finally to remind that the Atlantic Council's Europe Center is going to be continuing to bring you conversations on this and other related topics as part of our digital marketplace initiatives. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye for now.